My name is Emma, and for 11 years I carried the crushing weight of believing I had destroyed my sister's life. It started when I was 18, fresh out of high school with a full scholarship to Stanford University. I had dreams, plans, a future that stretched out before me like an open highway. But all of that changed in what I thought was one terrible moment of carelessness. The morning I received my acceptance letter, I had danced around the kitchen while my parents watched with what I thought was pride. The story my parents told me was simple, devastating, and seemingly unshakable. I had been driving our family car with my younger sister Sarah in the passenger seat. According to them, I had been texting while driving, something I vehemently denied but couldn't prove otherwise. The crash was catastrophic, they said. Sarah suffered severe traumatic brain injury that would require lifelong care, specialized therapy, and constant supervision. The doctors, my parents explained with tears in their eyes, said she would never be the same again. "The medical bills alone will bankrupt us," my mother sobbed that first night in the hospital waiting room. Her mascara had streaked down her cheeks in black rivers, and she clutched a tissue box like a lifeline. "And Sarah will need round-the-clock care for the rest of her life." "How could you have been so reckless, Emma? How could you have done this to your own sister?" The words cut through me like shattered glass, each syllable embedding itself deep in my chest, where it would fester for over a decade. I remember staring at the sterile white walls of that waiting room, feeling like the air had been sucked from my lungs. The smell of disinfectant, mixed with my mother's perfume, created a nauseating cocktail that I would associate with guilt for years to come. My father sat in the corner, his head in his hands, occasionally looking up at me with eyes that seemed to say everything his mouth wouldn't. "This is all your fault," those eyes whispered. "You've destroyed our family." I gave up my scholarship immediately. While my classmates headed off to college that fall, I stayed home and worked 3 part-time jobs to help pay for Sarah's mounting medical expenses. I cleaned offices at dawn, my hands raw from industrial cleaning chemicals, and my back aching from hunching over countless desks. During the day, I worked retail at a department store, forcing smiles at customers while my heart felt like it was breaking with every breath. At night, I waited tables at a local diner, serving coffee and pie to people who seemed to have normal, uncomplicated lives. Every paycheck went directly to my parents to cover therapy sessions, medical equipment, and specialized care. I watched my savings account money I had earned from years of babysitting and summer jobs dwindle to nothing. The account that once held my dreams of independence became just another casualty of what I believed was my terrible mistake. I would check the balance obsessively, watching the numbers decrease like a countdown to my own disappearance. The guilt consumed me entirely. I couldn't look at Sarah without seeing the vibrant, quick-witted 15-year-old she had been before the accident. She used to debate with our father about politics at the dinner table, her eyes flashing with intelligence and passion. She had been planning to run for student council president, had already been accepted into advanced placement classes for her junior year. Now she moved slowly, spoke little, and seemed to exist in a perpetual fog that my parents attributed to her brain injury. "She's trying so hard to recover," my father would say, his voice heavy with what I interpreted as accusation. He would stand in the doorway of Sarah's room, watching her struggle with what appeared to be simple tasks. "The least you can do is sacrifice a little to help her heal. After all, this is your responsibility, Emma, your burden to bear." His words felt like stones being placed on my chest, one by one, until I could barely breathe under their weight. By the time I turned 25, I had given up 7 years of my life to what I believed was my penance. I had no college degree, no real career prospects, and no social life to speak of. While my former classmates were graduating, getting married, and starting careers, I was changing Sarah's bed sheets and driving her to endless therapy appointments. Every weekend was spent at home, every vacation was canceled, every relationship I attempted crumbled under the weight of my guilt and obligations. My high school friends had tried to stay in touch at first, but gradually their calls became less frequent. They would invite me to parties or gatherings, but I always had to decline because Sarah needed me. "Maybe next time" became my constant refrain until they stopped asking altogether. I watched through social media as they moved forward with their lives' engagement announcements, graduation photos, career milestones, while I remained frozen in the same bedroom where I had slept since middle school. My parents were masters at reinforcing my sense of responsibility without ever directly blaming me. "Sarah had such potential before the accident," my mother would sigh while folding the laundry I had paid for. She would hold up one of Sarah's old honor roll certificates, her fingers tracing the gold seal like she was touching a relic of a lost civilization. She was going to be valedictorian, you know. Had her whole life planned out. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I had stolen that future from her, and now I owed her mine in return. I lived in my childhood bedroom, sleeping on the same twin bed I'd had since middle school, surrounded by relics of the dreams I'd abandoned. My Stanford acceptance letter still hung on the bulletin board, yellowed and mocking. Sometimes I would lie awake at night, calculating how much money I had given my parents over the years. Between my direct contributions and the opportunities I had foregone, the number was staggering easily over $200,000. But the financial cost paled in comparison to the emotional price I was paying. The worst part wasn't the money, though. It was the way my parents had systematically isolated me from anything that might give me independence or happiness. When I mentioned maybe taking night classes, my mother would suddenly develop a mysterious illness that required me to stay home with Sarah. "I'm having chest pains again," she would say, clutching her left arm dramatically. "The doctor said stress could trigger another episode." You know how worried I get when Sarah doesn't have proper supervision. When I started dating someone seriously, my father would have urgent financial crises that demanded my immediate attention and all my spare time. "The insurance company is fighting us on Sarah's physical therapy," he would announce, just as I was getting ready for a date. "We need you to call them, Emma. You're the only one who understands all the details." These crises always seemed to coincide with moments when I was building connections outside the family. "Family comes first," was their constant refrain, and I had internalized it so completely that I felt selfish for wanting anything for myself. The few times I pushed back, even gently, the guilt trips would intensify. "After everything we've sacrificed for you girls," my mother would say, tears welling in her eyes, "this is how you repay us? By abandoning Sarah in her time of need?" The words would hit me like physical blows, sending me retreating back into compliance. I remember one particularly painful conversation with my best friend from high school, Jessica, who had driven 2 hours to visit me on my 26th birthday. We sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals and faded movie posters, while she tried to understand why I had disappeared from her life. "Emma, this isn't normal," she said gently, her voice filled with concern. "You're not responsible for taking care of your entire family. You deserve to have a life of your own." "You don't understand," I replied, the words feeling automatic and rehearsed. "Sarah needs me. I caused this. I have to make it right." Even as I spoke, I could hear how hollow the words sounded, but they had become such a fundamental part of my identity that questioning them felt like questioning my very existence. Jessica left that day with tears in her eyes, and I never saw her again. Another relationship sacrificed on the altar of my misplaced guilt. The isolation became a self-reinforcing cycle. The longer I stayed trapped in this dynamic, the more I began to believe that this was all I deserved. My self-worth became so tied to my role as Sarah's caretaker that I couldn't imagine who I would be without it. "This is your purpose," my mother would remind me when I seemed particularly down. "Not everyone gets to make such a meaningful difference in someone's life." As I approached my 30th birthday, something began to shift. Maybe it was the accumulation of small inconsistencies, or maybe I was finally developing enough emotional distance to see clearly. But I started noticing things about Sarah that didn't quite add up with her supposed condition. The changes were subtle at first, moments of clarity that seemed too sharp, movements that appeared too coordinated for someone with severe brain damage. The first incident that really caught my attention happened on a Tuesday afternoon when I came home early from work. I had been fighting a migraine all day and decided to call in sick to my evening shift at the restaurant. The house was supposed to be empty except for Sarah, who was supposed to be resting in her room according to her daily schedule. As I quietly entered through the back door, I heard something that made me freeze in place. Sarah's laughter, clear and unrestrained, coming from the living room. When I peered around the corner, I saw her sitting cross-legged on the floor, engrossed in a complex jigsaw puzzle. It wasn't one of the simple children's puzzles my parents had been buying for her therapy. This was a 1,500-piece landscape scene that would challenge even someone with perfect cognitive function. Her movements were quick and precise, her eyes focused and alert. She was sorting pieces by color and pattern with the kind of systematic approach that suggested sophisticated problem-solving abilities. The moment she noticed me, everything changed. Her posture slumped, her expression grew vacant, and she began the slow, labored movements I had associated with her condition for over a decade. The transformation was so sudden and complete that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined what I'd just witnessed. "Hi, Emma," she said in the flat, monotone voice that had become her default around me. "I was just trying to do this puzzle. It's very hard for me." "That's a pretty complicated puzzle for someone with your condition," I said carefully, testing the waters. Sarah's eyes flickered with something fear, annoyance, before she resumed her vacant expression. "Mom bought it for me," she replied slowly, as if each word required enormous effort. "She said, the doctor thought it might help with my coordination." But I had seen her just moments before, working on it with the focus and dexterity of someone whose cognitive abilities were perfectly intact. Over the following weeks, I became more observant. I started coming home at unexpected times, listening at doors, and watching Sarah when she didn't know I was there. I noticed that her difficulties seemed to intensify whenever our parents were around, but when she thought she was alone, she moved and spoke normally. I caught her reading complex novels when she thought no one was watching, then hastily switching to children's picture books when she heard footsteps. Once, I overheard her having what sounded like a perfectly normal phone conversation with someone. Her voice was animated and articulate in a way I hadn't heard since before the supposed accident. "I know it's complicated," she was saying, her tone sharp and intelligent, "but I can't just stop now. Too much is at stake." When I knocked on her door moments later, she was back to her slow, confused persona, claiming she hadn't been on the phone at all. The most damning evidence came when I installed a small recording device in the living room, hidden behind a picture frame. I felt terrible about spying on my own sister, but I needed to know if my suspicions were justified. What I captured over the next week was hours of Sarah behaving completely normally when she was alone, talking to herself with perfect clarity, moving around the house with ease, even exercising with coordination that would be impossible for someone with her supposed injuries. When I tried to discuss these observations with my parents, they were quick to shut down my questions. "Brain injuries are complex, Emma," my father would say with a condescending tone that made my skin crawl. He would look at me like I was a child trying to understand advanced mathematics. "Patients can have good days and bad days. Just because she seems better sometimes doesn't mean she's recovered. Are you questioning years of medical expertise because of a few isolated incidents?" My mother was even more direct in her dismissal. "Are you questioning the doctors? Are you trying to minimize what you did to her?" Her voice would rise with each word, building to a crescendo of righteous indignation. Some sister you are, looking for excuses to abandon her when she needs you most. I can't believe you would even suggest that Sarah is faking her condition. What kind of person thinks that way about their own family? The gaslighting was so effective that I began to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe I was seeing what I wanted to see because the burden of care had become too heavy. Maybe my guilt was making me paranoid, looking for reasons to justify abandoning my responsibilities. But deep down, a small voice kept whispering that something was very wrong with the story I had been told for 11 years. I started researching brain injuries online, reading medical journals and case studies late into the night. What I learned made my suspicions grow stronger. The pattern of Sarah's supposed symptoms didn't match any documented case of traumatic brain injury I could find. Her condition seemed to improve and worsen in ways that had more to do with who was watching than with any medical reality. The truth revealed itself on a rainy Thursday evening in October, when I was 29 years old and had been living this lie for 11 years. I was helping my mother reorganize the medicine cabinet, a task that had become necessary as Sarah's supposed treatments had multiplied over the years. The cabinet was crammed with bottles of vitamins and supplements that my parents claimed were essential for Sarah's recovery, most of which I had paid for with money I could barely afford to spare. As I pulled out the bottom drawer to clean behind it, I felt something crinkle against the back panel. The drawer had always been difficult to remove completely, but today it came out further than usual, revealing a gap between the drawer and the cabinet frame. Wedged in that space was a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with tape that had long since lost its adhesive properties. My hands trembled as I carefully extracted it, and my heart began to race when I saw my name written on the front in my father's handwriting. The envelope was dated just 3 days after Sarah's accident, and it was addressed to me specifically. Inside were medical records, not the brief, vague summaries my parents had shown me over the years, but detailed, comprehensive reports from the hospital where Sarah had been treated. As I read through the pages in the dim light of the bathroom, my entire world began to collapse and rebuild itself simultaneously. The fluorescent bulb above the mirror flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the pages. The report was clear, detailed, and utterly damning. Sarah had sustained minor injuries in the accident, a mild concussion, some superficial cuts, and bruising. She had been observed for 24 hours and released with instructions for rest and follow-up care. There was no brain injury, no cognitive damage, no need for long-term medical intervention. The attending physician had noted that Sarah was alert, oriented, and demonstrating normal cognitive function at the time of discharge. But it was the handwritten notes from the attending physician that truly shattered me. Patient's family appears to be fabricating or exaggerating symptoms. One note read in precise medical handwriting. Mother and father have been coaching patient on how to appear more severely injured than initial examination suggests. Recommend social services follow-up to ensure child's welfare and investigate possible Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Another note, dated a week later, stated, Family declined, recommended psychological evaluation. Patient appears to be exhibiting learned helplessness behaviors consistent with family pressure. No medical basis for claimed cognitive impairment. I sat on the cold bathroom floor clutching those pages as 11 years of my life rearranged themselves in my mind. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every abandoned dream, all of it had been built on an elaborate lie. My parents hadn't just hidden the truth from me. They had actively constructed a false reality and manipulated both Sarah and me into maintaining it. The weight of this realization felt like a physical force pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. That night, I confronted my family with the medical records spread out on the kitchen table like evidence in a trial. The familiar yellow tablecloth suddenly looked garish under the harsh overhead light, and the cheerful sunflower patterns seemed to mock the gravity of the moment. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, relief, and finally, resignation. My parents, however, moved quickly from denial to justification, as if they had been preparing for this moment for years. "You don't understand the full situation," my father began, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I had heard thousands of times before. He adjusted his glasses and leaned back in his chair, assuming the posture of a teacher about to explain a complex concept to a slow student. "Sarah needed stability, and you were always so ambitious, so ready to leave us behind. We knew that if you went to college, you'd never come back. We'd lose both our daughters instead of just having one who needed help." "We watched you packing for Stanford," my mother added, her voice taking on a wistful quality that made my stomach turn. "You were so excited, so ready to start your new life. But what about us? What about Sarah? You would have forgotten all about your family the moment you stepped on that campus. We've seen it happen to other families. Children go away to school and never look back." My mother was more direct in her emotional manipulation. "We did this because we love you, Emma. We knew you'd throw yourself into your career and forget about family. Look how devoted you've been, how much you've grown as a person through this experience. Would you really trade that for some degree and a job that would just make you stressed and unhappy? Would you really choose strangers over your own sister?" The audacity of their justifications left me speechless for several moments. They were actually trying to convince me that destroying my life had been an act of love, that stealing my future had been for my own good. "You stole 11 years from me," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. 11 years of my life that I can never get back. You made me believe I was a monster. But it was Sarah's reaction that cut me the deepest. When I turned to her, expecting anger or indignation at being forced to participate in this deception, she instead looked at me with fear. Her carefully practiced vacant expression had been replaced by something raw and desperate. "Please don't leave, Emma," she whispered, and for the first time in years her voice carried genuine emotion. "I know it was wrong, but I was scared that if I got better, nobody would pay attention to me anymore." "You were always the smart one, the successful one," Sarah continued, tears streaming down her face. "Being sick was the only way I felt special. When the accident first happened, I really was hurt. Not badly, but enough that everyone was worried about me. For the first time in my life, I was the center of attention instead of you. Mom and Dad were so focused on taking care of me, and you were so guilty and sorry. I liked feeling important. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in gaslighting and emotional manipulation. My parents alternated between minimizing what they had done, it wasn't that big of a lie, and catastrophizing what would happen if I left. Sarah will never recover from the abandonment. They painted my desire for independence as selfishness and my anger as overreaction. "After everything we've sacrificed for you," my mother said through tears, "this is how you repay us?" "Think about all the character you've built through this experience," my father added, his voice taking on the tone of a motivational speaker. "You're more compassionate now, more mature, more responsible than any of your old friends. They're all shallow and self-centered, focused only on their careers and material success. You've learned what really matters in life: family, sacrifice, love. Isn't that worth more than any college degree?" "And what about Sarah?" my mother chimed in, reaching across the table to grab my hand. "She's been depending on you for so long. If you abandon her now, who knows what it will do to her psychologically? She could have a complete breakdown. Is your selfish desire for independence worth destroying your sister's mental health? Is it worth tearing apart our entire family?" I pulled my hand away from my mother's grasp, feeling disgusted by the manipulation, even as part of me responded to it automatically. "You're talking about my mental health," I said, my voice growing stronger. "What about what this has done to me? What about the depression, the anxiety, The complete loss of identity I've experienced. What about the fact that I'm 30 years old and I don't even know who I am outside of being Sarah's caretaker? You're being dramatic, my father replied dismissively. Depression is just self-pity in disguise. You've had a good life here, Emma. You've been loved and supported and given a clear purpose. Most people would be grateful for that kind of stability and meaning. Instead, you're focusing on what you think you've missed out on, things that probably wouldn't have made you happy anyway. The gaslighting was so sophisticated, so layered with elements of truth and love, that I found myself questioning my own reaction, even as I held the evidence of their deception in my hands. They knew exactly which buttons to push, which vulnerabilities to exploit, and which guilt trips would send me back into compliance. Maybe we did bend the truth a little, my mother conceded, but our intentions were good. Everything we did out of love. I didn't leave that night, or even that month. 11 years of psychological conditioning doesn't disappear overnight, and I found myself questioning my own perceptions, even as I held the proof of their deception in my hands. I had been so thoroughly programmed to prioritize their needs over my own that the idea of putting myself first felt genuinely foreign and wrong. The internal conflict was exhausting. Part of me knew they had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible, while another part of me still felt guilty for wanting to abandon my responsibilities. Instead, I began seeing a therapist secretly, paying for sessions with money I told my parents was going toward Sarah's treatment. I had to drive to the next town over and use a fake name for the appointments because I was terrified that my parents would find out and sabotage this one thing I was doing for myself. Dr. Rodriguez was the first person in over a decade who validated my feelings without trying to redirect them toward family obligation. What you've experienced, she told me during our third session, is a form of psychological abuse called parentification. Your parents made you responsible for problems that were never yours to solve, and they used guilt and manipulation to maintain that dynamic. She spoke in a calm, measured voice that never carried judgment, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone was truly listening to me without an agenda. The fact that they involved your sister in this deception makes it even more damaging, Dr. Rodriguez continued. They didn't just steal your opportunities, they corrupted your relationship with the person you were trying to help. They turned your love and guilt into weapons against you, and that's one of the most profound betrayals a family can commit. The process of disentangling myself from their control was painful and slow. I had to learn to recognize when they were manipulating me, which was difficult because their techniques had become so sophisticated over the years. They knew exactly which buttons to push, which vulnerabilities to exploit, and which guilt trips would send me back into compliance. Every time I set a boundary, they would escalate their emotional appeals until I caved. Gradually, though, I began to see the relationship more clearly. I realized that my parents had essentially stolen my young adulthood and used Sarah's complicity to do it. They had isolated me from friends, sabotaged my romantic relationships, and convinced me that seeking my own happiness was a betrayal of family loyalty. The money was just one aspect of the theft. They had also stolen my confidence, my independence, and my sense of self-worth. Dr. Rodriguez helped me understand the sophisticated nature of the manipulation I had endured. Healthy families encourage independence and growth, she explained during one of our sessions. Toxic families create dependence and stagnation. Your parents didn't just want your help with Sarah, they wanted your entire life. They wanted to control your choices, your relationships, your future, and they used your love for your sister to do it. The hardest part was accepting that Sarah, while also a victim in many ways, had chosen to participate in my exploitation. She was only 15 when it started, and I could understand her initial compliance. A teenager might not fully grasp the long-term consequences of such a deception. But as she grew older and more aware of what they were doing to me, She had continued to play her part. The sister I had sacrificed everything for had watched me give up my dreams and said nothing. Sarah was also being manipulated, Dr. Rodriguez reminded me when I expressed anger toward my sister. Your parents taught her that love and attention were conditional, that she had to be sick or needy to be valued. But that doesn't excuse her continued participation as an adult, and it doesn't minimize the harm done to you. You can have compassion for her situation while still holding her accountable for her choices. I began to see how the entire family dynamic had been constructed around keeping me trapped. Every crisis, every emergency, every guilt trip had been carefully orchestrated to prevent me from developing independence. When I thought about leaving for college, Sarah would have a setback. When I started dating someone, my parents would have a financial emergency. When I showed signs of developing interests outside the family, someone would get sick and need my immediate attention. They created a closed system, Dr. Rodriguez explained, where your worth was entirely dependent on your usefulness to them. In healthy relationships, people are valued for who they are, not just for what they can provide. Your parents taught you that love was conditional on sacrifice, that family loyalty meant self-destruction. That's not love, that's exploitation. The realization that I had been systematically abused was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it meant the problem wasn't with me. I wasn't selfish or ungrateful or fundamentally flawed. Devastating because it meant that the people who were supposed to protect and nurture me had instead predated upon my love and loyalty. The parents I had tried so hard to please had never had my best interests at heart. My liberation didn't come as a dramatic confrontation or a stormy exit. Instead, it unfolded slowly over the course of 6 months, as I methodically prepared for a life independent of my family's manipulation. I opened a secret bank account, researched apartments in other cities, and quietly began the process of reclaiming my identity. The decision to leave was both the hardest and easiest thing I had ever done. Hard because it meant acknowledging that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had instead used that love as a weapon against me. Easy because once I truly accepted that truth, staying became impossible. I chose a Saturday morning in spring to tell them. I had already secured an apartment 3 hours away, enrolled in community college to begin the process of earning my degree, and found a job that would allow me to support myself while I rebuilt my life. I didn't ask for their permission or their blessing. I simply informed them of my decision. I've spent 11 years of my life paying for a crime I didn't commit, I told them as they sat around the same kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals and where they had fed me lies for over a decade. I'm not angry anymore, and I'm not looking for apologies or explanations. I'm just done. My mother cried, my father argued, and Sarah begged me to reconsider. They pulled out every manipulation technique they had perfected over the years. They questioned my mental health, my gratitude, and my character. They threatened to cut me off completely, as if that weren't exactly what I was trying to achieve. But for the first time in my adult life, their words bounced off me like rain on glass. Moving away felt like waking up from a very long, very confusing dream. For the first time since I was 18, I woke up each morning without the crushing weight of guilt and obligation determining my every decision. I could eat what I wanted, watch what I wanted, and go where I wanted without having to justify my choices to anyone. The apartment I rented was small and sparsely furnished, but it was mine. I bought my own groceries, paid my own bills, and made my own schedule. These simple freedoms, which most people my age had been enjoying for over a decade, felt revolutionary. I would sometimes just sit in my living room, marveling at the fact that I could choose to do absolutely nothing without someone needing me to justify that choice. Starting college at 30 was humbling but exhilarating. I was older than most of my classmates, and I had to work harder to master subjects that came easily to minds more recently removed from high school. But I had something most of them lacked,
a profound appreciation for the opportunity to learn. Every lecture, every assignment, every exam was a privilege I had thought I would never experience. I chose to major in psychology, partly because my own therapy had been so transformative, and partly because I wanted to understand the dynamics that had trapped me for so long. Studying family systems, psychological abuse, and trauma responses gave me a framework for understanding my experience and helped me process the complex emotions I still carried. The hardest part of my new life wasn't the practical challenges, though there were many, but learning to trust my own judgment. 30 years of having my perceptions questioned and my needs dismissed had left me second-guessing every decision. I would stand in the grocery store for 20 minutes, paralyzed by the simple choice between two brands of cereal, terrified of making the wrong decision. I maintained minimal contact with my family during my first year away. We exchanged brief text messages on holidays and birthdays, but I made it clear that I wouldn't engage in lengthy conversations about their feelings regarding my departure. They made several attempts to guilt me into returning, each one following a predictable pattern of crisis and emotional emergency that supposedly required my immediate attention. Sarah reached out to me directly about 8 months after I left. She called me one evening crying, and for a moment I felt the familiar pull of responsibility and guilt. But instead of immediately comforting her, I listened. Really listened. What I heard wasn't genuine remorse or understanding, but a sophisticated manipulation attempt disguised as vulnerability. "I miss you so much, Emma," she sobbed into the phone. "I know what we did was wrong, but I was just a kid when it started." I didn't know how to stop it. Now Mom and Dad are making me get a job, and it's so hard. I don't know how to do anything because I've been sick for so long. I need you to help me figure out how to be normal again. For a brief moment, I felt the old patterns reasserting themselves. The urge to fix her problems, to rush home and smooth over her difficulties, to sacrifice my own progress for her comfort. But then I recognized what was happening. Even her apparent honesty about the deception was being weaponized to manipulate me into resuming my caretaker role. "Sarah," I said gently but firmly, "you're 26 years old. You spent 11 years pretending to be disabled, which means you're perfectly capable of learning whatever skills you need to succeed. I believe in your ability to figure this out on your own." The conversation ended shortly after that, and I felt both sad and proud of my ability to maintain my boundaries. 2 years after leaving home, I graduated with my associate degree and transferred to a 4-year university to complete my bachelor's in psychology. The graduation ceremony was small and quiet. I had invited no family members, but it represented a triumph that felt larger than any celebration could capture. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I thought about the 18-year-old girl who had given up her Stanford scholarship, and I whispered a promise to her. We made it. We finally made it. My relationship with my family evolved into something I could live with, though it would never be what most people would consider normal. I established firm boundaries about what I would and wouldn't discuss, what kind of help I would and wouldn't provide, and how often we would communicate. They tested these boundaries regularly, but I held firm. During my junior year, I began volunteering at a crisis counseling center, working with people who had experienced various forms of abuse and manipulation. The work was challenging and sometimes triggering, but it gave me a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before. Helping others recognize and escape toxic family dynamics felt like a way of honoring the girl I had been and the years I had lost. I also began dating for the first time in my adult life. Learning to trust someone romantically after spending decades in manipulative relationships was difficult, but my therapy had given me the tools to recognize healthy versus unhealthy patterns. When I met David, a fellow psychology student who was kind, patient, and respectful of my boundaries, I discovered what it felt like to be loved without conditions or ulterior motives.
On my 32nd birthday, I received a card from my mother, the first direct communication we'd had in over 6 months. Inside, she had written, "I hope you're happy with the choices you've made. We miss the daughter you used to be." The message was clearly intended to make me feel guilty, but instead, it made me smile. She was right. I was happy with my choices, and the daughter I used to be was exactly who I had needed to leave behind. Today, I work as a family therapist, specializing in cases involving psychological manipulation and parentification. My office walls are decorated with my diplomas, the bachelor's degree I earned at 32, the master's degree I completed at 34, along with thank you notes from clients who have found their way to healthier relationships. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the years I lost, or if I wish I could have figured out the truth sooner. The honest answer is complicated. Yes, I mourn the young woman I might have been, the experiences I missed, the confidence I might have developed if I had been supported instead of exploited. But I also recognize that my experience, as painful as it was, gave me insights and empathy that make me better at my work and more appreciative of my freedom. I keep the original medical report in a frame on my desk, not as a reminder of the betrayal, but as a symbol of the truth's power to liberate. Underneath it, I've written a quote that sustains me through difficult days. "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off." I learned that truth, literally and metaphorically, has the power to transform everything. My relationship with my family remains limited but civil. Sarah eventually did get a job and seems to be building an independent life, though we rarely speak. My parents still occasionally try to guilt me into resuming my old role, but their attempts feel less personal, now more like background noise than emotional warfare. I wish them well, but I no longer confuse love with sacrifice or family loyalty with self-destruction. The most profound change in my life isn't my career success or my healthy relationship or even my financial independence. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing I can trust myself. After spending my entire young adulthood being told that my perceptions were wrong and my needs were selfish, learning to honor my own voice has been the greatest gift I could give myself. On quiet Sunday mornings when I'm sitting in my apartment with a cup of coffee and no obligations pulling me in any direction, I sometimes think about that 18-year-old girl who believed she had ruined her sister's life. I want to tell her that she was innocent, that she deserved better, and that someday she would find the strength to save herself. But mostly, I just feel grateful that I finally did.